I don't expect people to believe me, but I know what I saw. It was about 2 a.m. I was sitting at my desk, and I looked up because I saw a person walk across the range and into the shower area, which is impossible because I was the only officer in there, and all the inmates were locked down. It freaked me out, so I got up to make a round. There was a Native American inmate in the cell, directly adjacent to the shower, that saw it also. He asked me if I just saw what he did. I told him yes, and we both kind of chuckled. The ghost, or whatever you want to call it, is that of a Native American that had hung himself in that housing unit decades earlier. He tends to appear to other natives when they are in the unit. Another time, the same ghost appeared to another young native inmate who told me how this native dude was sitting on the end of his bed one night just looking at him. I had never told this inmate about the ghost. I worked in a lockdown for violent sex offenders for way too long, and got told very calmly, as soon as you're alone and there's no one to save you, I'm going to fuck you to death. What's scarier though, is the really manipulative guys who will listen in on you constantly and memorize any bit of personal information you let slip. Then, when they want something, they'll come to you like they know you and start telling you stuff about your life that you don't realize they piece together. Also, prisoners have access to public record, so as soon as they know your name, they'll put on orders for every bit of info that they can. I had this inmate that hadn't showered in weeks. She smelled terrible, and she was in secured housing, so her bunkmate had been making complaints. After a certain amount of time, a lack of hygiene is a disciplinary violation. She goes to confinement for a forced shower. I'm fairly new in the department at this time, so, of course, I get the grunt work. I have to go to her locker, retrieve her property, and inventory it for storage. She refuses to give us a lock combination, so we have to use the bolt cutters. I finally get it open, and it's filthy. She has a bag of wet, dirty clothes. I double glove up at this point. The clothes are mildewed. I take the bag of clothes out and find used maxi pads all over her property. At the time, I was in complete shock, but I couldn't show it. There were roaches coming out of the locker as I pulled more stuff out. Just disgusting. I finally get to her paperwork. I was sure that the worst was behind me. Nope. The first folder is full of demonic torn figures. Pages and pages of them. Real grisly pictures, decapitations, torture, and tons of blood. I thought that these figures were just scribbled in for color, but after I looked closely, it was officers' names written hundreds of times within these characters. Each character was an officer. Each dead officer was a staff member that was no longer there. I've had inmates threaten to kill me. Inmates tell me my address, my license plate number, and where I'm from. But to this day, that creepy old woman is the scariest thing I've ever dealt with. As a CO, or correctional officer, I've seen my fair share of creepy shit. The one thing I saw that disturbed me the most was when I was working in a sex offender unit, and when I was doing my routine rounds, I went past a cell that housed a dangerous rapist. He was wearing a mask he had made and standing in his underwear. The creepy part about this, the mask was made from a cutout in the paper of a face of a friend of mine who had just made the cheerleading squad for a local football team. When she made the team, they put a photo of her in the newspaper. Bet she didn't know it would be used for this, and as far as I'm concerned, she will never know. I'm a CO at a county jail. One night, this real hard ass that pretty much ran the pot came up to me and said,
"Hey man, you live on East Street, right? 2 houses in from the corner? You drive that little black Chevy, don't you?"
I nervously stammered out a no and walked away, but he was exactly right, and he knew it. He and his buddies hassled me the rest of the shift. First time I'd ever even thought about buying a gun. On midnight shift, you count the inmates at 12 a.m., 3 a.m., and 5 a.m. I worked in a high-rise prison in a downtown major city in the U.S., and each floor had 2 units, which were the mirror images of one another. There was 1 CO, or correctional officer, per unit, and we would count each other's unit. So, after the 12 a.m. count, you end up counting pretty quickly for the 3 and 5 a.m. counts. There are normally 2 inmates to a cell, so you just shine your flashlight through the window of the cell and count the lumps in the bed. I get to just the 4th or 5th window, and I noticed one guy was not in bed and looked like he was praying, which isn't completely crazy. Muslim inmates have to pray at weird times. So, I move on to the next window, and as I'm counting 2 more, I think, wait, something was up with that praying guy. I really don't know what made me think of that, and I go back to the previous cell window and flash my light, and there's this lifeless body hanging ever so slightly from a string tied to the top bunk. He had no blood in his face, and his body was completely limp, so I knew he was dead. I hit my body alarm and had control call EMS. I woke up his cellmate who was in the top bunk and removed him from the cell. Here's the amazing part. The inmate used the string that was in his laundry bag to hang himself. He didn't even remove the string from the bag. He tied it through a quarter-size hole in the metal top bunk. The bunk is only 5.5 feet tall, so picture, the inmate puts the rope around his neck, but he was taller than the bunk, so he had to get in the kneeling position to begin to cut off the circulation. The part that has always stuck with me is that all he had to do was stand up to stop the process. His hands nor his feet were tied. He had such a desire to die that he just stayed in that kneeling position until he passed out and eventually asphyxiated. He was only in prison for about 2 weeks. He was arrested for molesting children over many years. I work at a county jail. A lady drowned her kids in the bathtub and was being housed in the women's unit at my jail. I was with the nurse doing med rounds, and while we were in that pod, this lady let out a blood-curdling scream and then chilled me to my bones. I hear people yell and scream all the time, but this was different. I can't describe it in words, but it was one of the more disturbing things that I've ever heard. I worked at a county jail for 2 years, and most of the inmates were waiting to go to the penitentiary. One day, this guy entered my unit and started bragging on how he raped a girl. Well, it was another inmate's younger sister. I remember hearing yelling coming out of an inmate's cell during their activity time, so I called a code 4, a disturbance, and ran over to see what was going on. Inmate number 1, the rapist, was being held down by 3 other inmates, and inmate 2, the victim's brother, had his arm all the way down to his elbow in the other guy's ass. After we separated them, and inmate 2 was moved to administrative segregation, or solitary confinement, I finally got a chance to ask why he did that specifically. His response was, and I quote, "Man, that motherfucker was a marked bitch, like some puppet-ass bitch, so I gave the Muppets a new character." I will never forget what I saw that day. The worst thing that I've ever had happen to me was when I was doing rounds, and this inmate in his cell stopped me and said, "Hey, CO, check this out." And then he slit his throat with a razor blade.